Angry Dragon is the name of the game. So we've got black against Angry Dragon. He goes for d4. Let's just go for d5 here, and let's play Slav. We usually don't play Slav, but why not? Here, white goes for the fianchetto Slav, which is very similar actually to what we were just playing in the last game here. Some possibility to transpose here after e6. And I wonder, do I have time for this? I'm just going to play e6 actually, because I'm not so concerned by this idea. I could even take, queen check and grab this pawn, although usually those lines are pretty risky. I'm going to go h6. So I'm just going to play, just essentially going to play the same thing. So yeah. Hopefully this time around I won't make the same middle game mistakes as the last time. So my opponent goes knight d2, and in general these setups I think they're just quite comfortable for black. Knight d2 I'm not so sure about as a move, because now the bishop is hemmed in. Of course, we can't really ever speak of any significant advantage for either player in these positions, because they're very solid. White has a little bit more space, but as I say, this bishop on g2 tends to be a bit misplaced in these structures, unless you can get in an e4 break, but it's kind of difficult to do that. To do that under good circumstances, because whenever you play e4, even if you provoke d takes e4, first of all, this chain is still pretty strong against this bishop, and certainly if you play f3 and then e4 and I take, you have to be extremely careful you don't lose this pawn on d4, because then you'll have pushed your pawns like this, and this guy will be easily targeted, and also along this g1 to a7 diagonal. Okay, so he goes a3 here, and I'm not so worried about this move. I think I will just challenge his knight here on e5. In general, in chess, when you're not sure what to do, a bad strategy is never a bad strategy to just say, okay, I'm gonna take my my undeveloped piece or my worst piece, and I'm just gonna try and trade it for my opponent's best piece. So that's what I'm doing here with the move knight e7. And white says, not so fast. If you try to trade it, I'm going to maybe capture with the f pawn, and then I'm going to have this central pawn mass. The first question is that such a concern? And I think the answer to that is it isn't. I mean, I could take, and then jump onto e4 myself, something like that. And I think those kind of positions would be approximately equal. But I'm wondering, do I have something better? For example, I could break with c5, which on the one hand may strengthen this bishop, but we shouldn't be too rigid in our way of thinking, because there are some benefits to c5, like, for example, I mean, concretely, this pawn is under attack, and if he goes e3, we take, and then he could wind up down the road with wind up down the road. Aren't those lyrics? But anyway, he could end up with an isolated pawn on d4. So I think c5 is a very interesting move, just to try and create some nice play. I mean, another principle here in chess is that white has a little bit more space in the center. The reason for this is because these are symmetrical, but obviously he's played both f4 and c4. Especially if we just take this situation, which is kind of the Slav or semi-Slav situation, it's this key difference. So in a lot of the time, there's too much pressure on d5 for black to counter with c5. Of course, there are openings where black says, I don't care, I'll play c5 anyway, like the Lichess Defense. But here in this particular position, we can play like this because the pawn on d5 is defended twice and it's only attacked once. And also the fact that he's played f4 makes an attack against d4 more attractive, because if we can loosen up this diagonal, we might at some point have some ideas around involving checks here, and even moves like knight g4 and knight f2 and knight e3. So there's always ideas like that. We're also not super concerned by the possibility that down the line he'll take this pawn, because that, first of all, that's a long way away, and yeah, I mean, even if you got a situation like a rook here, I don't know what situation that I can think of. I guess we would be potentially bothered by losing this pawn, because if we lost this pawn, this knight would become very strong, as it could then do things like knight to c6. So we are a bit concerned by losing this pawn. I changed my evaluation of what I was saying originally. But on the other hand, it's hard to see how short of a blunder, how he's actually going to access that pawn, because d5 is very solid. One detail to note is a lot of the time you might have heard that usually the only want to play c5 when this knight can go to c6. That's not always the case, but it is usually the case. However, his own knight is not placed here, so it would be very different. I'd be much less inclined if his knight was on c3 and my knight was on d7 to play c5. But it's all relative, so the fact that my knight may be slightly less well placed here than if it was here is not as big of a concern, because his own knight is also suffering from the same fate. So he puts his knight on b3. This tells me, though, this pawn here, there are some possibilities like takes, and takes on c4. The problem there is after taking, bishop takes f6, I'm down a piece for a pawn, but if he moves his knight, he'd have to move it back to d2, because if he takes here, I'd have bishop d4. And then after he moves it to d2, I would take on d4, and I'd be up 2 pawns, and his development would be very bad. So I think there'd be something interesting there. But on the other hand, it's a little bit more risk than I feel I need to take. This bishop is quite annoying in some situations. So another possibility I'm considering is just bishop e4, so that I can then start to think of d takes c4 ideas without having to worry about this this point that I mentioned earlier. So bishop e4 is very interesting to me. The only thing about bishop e4 is maybe a slight concern: knight takes, queen takes, and then taking this pawn, takes, and then he's up a pawn for the time being. I'm sure I can get it back. In fact, I see a line where I can get it back, like so: takes, then takes here, and then just take it, because my queen is defended. So that's one way in which I can get it back. And I think that the pawn on c5 then, which in this variation, for those of you who can see, the pawn on c5 is going to be very vulnerable. So after bishop e3 in that position, I could go rook c8. Then he goes rook c1. Yeah, if he goes rook c1 there, actually, he wins my c4 pawn. But maybe, yeah, I think that's probably about equal, actually, now that I think about it. So now I'm going to start to look for, do I have better lines? For example, after knight takes, I could go knight takes. Notice I definitely can't play this Zwischenzug, because he would play one back with knight takes Zwischenschach, right? Knight takes f6, check, and then he'd be picking up both of these knights and then my bishop, and I'd only pick up knight and bishop, so I'd lose a piece. So after knight takes d7, I have to take back in one way or another. Initially, I wanted to take with the queen, and the reason for this is because I want to be able to capture back with the knight in the event that he takes the bishop. But the drawback with taking with the queen is that he can take this pawn. And then I can, for example, take and take. And that's when I was saying this line, bishop takes, king takes, and then take on c4. But I think I need something better than taking on c4, because I don't like what I was seeing there. So one other idea that I have is, for example, to move queen c6. And then at that point, his pawns are like this. And if I go queen c6, he goes pawn takes, knight takes, his king is on g2. So there are a lot of checks, deadly discovered checks. If he goes e4, I can go knight f6, and there's two pieces. I'll have my queen here and my knight here hitting this pawn on e4 in that position. And otherwise, I'll be able to take the queenside pawn back. So again, very complicated analysis for some of the viewers. I'm sure it's getting a bit messy, this visualization. Nobody said chess was an easy game. He does go in a different direction though. He goes bishop takes e4, and that makes it a lot easier for me after knight takes e4, because now after this series of exchanges, I could go knight takes e5 by the way here, and if pawn takes, then go queen takes d5. That's quite interesting to me. I think what he wants is pawn takes, knight takes. I don't know what he actually wants. Maybe he wants this and then bishop e3, and I think he wants to play against my isolated pawn. So I'm gonna go knight takes e5 here first, and then this way, if he goes pawn takes e5, then after pawn takes d5, I have this healthy structure. And importantly, on the queen side, I'll actually have 4 pawns against 2. So he has some attacking possibilities if I go like this. If I take, he'll have a majority on the king side, so he can launch an attack. But what I'm arguing with the way of playing like this is that actually I'm arguing that his attack is not so scary, his majority is not so scary. If he goes f5, I can maybe even play a move like bishop g5, anticipating f6 ideas, or I could even consider playing f6 myself. Let him have this very strong protected passed pawn on e6, but argue that his knight on b3 is much worse than my knight on e4. His king is a little bit airy along the light squares, and my majority on the queen side is more relevant than this blockaded passed pawn. I'm not sure how much I buy that, because I don't like to give my opponent like a significant asset, long-term asset, like a protected passed pawn. That's a really serious, a healthily protected passed pawn is a very serious long-term asset to sort of just give to your opponent. So you have to have a good reason to do so. So after f5, I'd be much more inclined to do something else. Maybe even a move like rook e8 actually, and then say this pawn on e5 is a bit vulnerable. And if you go f6, I'll just drop the bishop back to f8, and then I'll hunt this pawn, even if you fracture my structure. He goes knight d2. Now one idea that I have is f5 here. I like this idea. Knight d2, by the way, makes a lot of sense. His knight was not so good. My knight is a very strong piece and can create some threats against the king. So he just challenges it. And I'm going f5, saying to him, well, if you do take my knight, that's inevitable, but I'm going to play f takes e4, and then I'm actually going to have even more pawns in the center. I'm going to improve my central situation. That does mean that I actually give him the protected passed pawn, but it's a little bit different, this situation, because the other protected passed pawn was even stronger for reasons that are a bit hard to talk about right now. But basically, I'll just very quickly say, so like if after f5, f6, e6, this pawn first of all is one square more advanced, and it's also protected by this pawn on f5 here, with my pawns being like this, and this pawn here on g7 is a backward pawn all of a sudden. So his pawns are like that, and my pawn on g7 is backward. My entire structure is really terrible on the king side. Whereas like this, my structure is quite healthy on the king side. Even if I've given him the protected passed pawn, it's a lot. I don't have any other problems besides that, and it's easier to contain this pawn because he has less space and less maneuverability. And the other thing is, because he has a dark squared bishop, if I let him get a clamp on the light squares, it's going to mean that this bishop is a much stronger piece. It becomes a much stronger piece. So I don't want any of that, basically. Whereas here, I don't mind so much to give this particular protected passed pawn. So I'm going queen d7, just protecting here and preparing rook here in the event that he does challenge my d5 pawn. One idea I have is c4 with the intention to put the bishop on c5 on the next move. The problem with this is, let's say queen c2, bishop here, e3. The problem is at some point he might go knight d4, and it's a bit strong maybe, but I think I'm okay with that, because now he cannot, if he goes here to e3, bishop c5, he would have to self-pin. That's very risky. It might be okay, but it's very risky, because I could do something like queen c7 to b6 and create some serious threats. He goes for e6, which in general I don't think is very good, because this pawn now should fall very soon. I think he needs to have kept his pawn protected here and sort of waited to use it down the line, give it a chance. For example, some king and pawn endgames would be very favorable, because by playing like this, I just move my queen. I think his idea was that if queen takes, he wanted to take here. And to be honest, I should have allowed that, because I think that after rook here, queen here, bishop d8, no, not bishop d8, he would have queen e5. Maybe I had some ways to trap his queen. I think there are definitely, it's definitely a possibility. The queen would have been very precariously placed here on b7 with so many of my pieces hovering around. So probably I could have spent a little bit more time on queen takes e6 and tried to goad him into taking, if I could see a concrete way of winning the queen, which I still can't, because he seems to have some escape route of queen c7, bit queen e5. But if I had to guess, I would say that there must be a way. Now I could take the pawn, but I think that I can take it on the next move. So I'm just actually gonna improve my queenside situation, just because now if let's say if I took the pawn, he might anticipate b5 with a4. But now after b5, if he goes a4, I can even push, or I can defend quite easily. Now I'll take it, and maybe I'll put my bishop on f6. After all, I think this is a better diagonal. This is a pretty smart plan from him, I think. I'm gonna go rook here, and now d4 is very interesting. But if he goes knight takes, I don't have so much there. So I'm gonna go rook here. He goes knight d4. I'll go queen here. He can take this pawn, but I'll take here. And if he goes bishop takes, yeah, actually he can do like that. I'll take like this, and if he takes this pawn, I'll hope. I think I've been a bit careless in my play, but if he does take this pawn, he recovers the material, but I can push with d4. And in this case now, with all the pieces like this lined up, this seems extremely scary. So knight g4, knight takes f5. And one trick when your opponent has very little time is usually try to, especially in like a regular game situation, one thing that I recommend is just not necessarily just calculate your first move, but also try and have like your second move calculated. So try and say, if knight takes f5, then I'm definitely certain that, let's say, as in this case, I'm playing queen e6, and so that you don't give your opponent reaction time. So queen takes f5 was actually my idea. So this was my little trick. Queen e6. The point is, I was expecting h3, but then queen takes f5 was the trick. And if he takes here, knight e3, and taking the queen on f5. And so this move gives him, by playing it very quickly and having an idea, it gives somebody who has little time very little, very few possibilities to actually, work things out. Whereas if you play, a common mistake I see is you might play knight g4, and after knight takes f5, then you go into the tank, right? Even though the move was relatively obvious, a lot of players, they'll go first knight g4, and then after this, they're still not quite sure how to proceed. So it's a good idea to try and think one move further when your opponent has little time, because it makes their job a lot harder. Okay, so some questions. So thank you, by the way, for to Angry Dragon, who's in the chat. Good game. Very very interesting in certain spots. Yeah, I think somehow or another the white setup is not so challenging. In the previous game, we saw Grandmaster Junior really showed ways of putting pressure on the black position, but in general, I don't have so much confidence in these setups with the fianchetto. And you can actually see here that although they are playable and some grandmasters even go for it, you can see that the black tournament results are pretty good. They're actually better than 50%. And probably if you then take the database, the Lichess database, probably you're also going to see pretty compelling results for black. So overall, yeah, I don't think that this is so great here. And yeah, you can see there's a variety of ways to play. Even the Masters, actually, this was a question I had if this was an issue, but they think probably figured that not this position, but rather once the knight is still here, you can actually take, and you've provoked this, and white still has to recover the pawn. So there's a lot of work to be done just for the fact that you've picked up the bishop pair. It's not so much.